Greetings. Thank you for tuning in to That Poetry Place. I'm deeply grateful that you're here. This is an encore presentation of the keynote address I recently delivered at UC Irvine's annual Medical Humanities Symposium, focusing on the poetry of hope and healing, loss, grief, and resilience. It was my honor to deliver this presentation, especially after this past year, beyond that even, when you consider what the healthcare community has endured in the wake of the COVID pandemic, which was declared roughly 23 months ago. We are all still spinning from repeated and relentless pandemic surges, followed by brief periods of specious calm, more surges, the hurricane that was the Delta variant, and the continuing tide of Omicron. The need for forums such as this is unquestionable. We must acknowledge the reality of our burden as caregivers, the shattering workloads, the unspeakable suffering, loss, and grief, but also the resolve and resiliency with which we carry on. Attention to the arts provides an exceptional key to healing the healers. As a bedside caregiver, I could not have survived the last 23 months without the arts. Poems, paintings, music, stories. These are my pillars and my lanterns. I am humbled to share with you a small offering of the poems I've written over the course of the pandemic, the words that bloomed into my third book with Press 53 titled My Borrowed Faith. This book is currently available for pre-order at press53.com, ships April 16th, official publication date. Check out that pre-order link if you would like a signed copy. Before I read my poems, I'm going to speak a little bit about my creative process. As an ER nurse, my work is ever informed by illness narratives. I think the best way to describe my writing style is by first considering an essential component of life, the blood vessel. Think of each poem as an artery and consider its structural elements. Of course, you have the vessel walls, blood cells, plasma, and electrolytes, but there's something else, something elemental. The hollow pathway inside the vessel, the opening through which everything flows, the lumen. Think of the borders of a blank page as the vessel walls, and the white space as the lumen. The words and punctuation are the blood products spilling through it. Also consider the economy of the human circulatory system. It takes an average of 0.8 seconds for the heart to complete one cardiac cycle. Ask yourself, what is that in words? Also consider these quotes from visual artist Ellsworth Kelly, and these photos were taken at his chapel of the UT campus in Austin, by the way. I'm not interested in edges. I'm interested in the mass and color, the black and white. The edges happen because the forms get as quiet as they can be. The large windows between the paintings interested me more than the art exhibited. From then on, painting as I had known it was finished for me. I'm not interested in the texture of a rock, but its shadow. I like silence. I want to paint something I've never seen before. I don't want to make what I'm looking at. I want the fragments. Also, it's important to realize that the white space on the page is just as important as the words that frame it. From Oppenheimer's paper on dwarf stars. What happens to a massive star that burns out? His calculations suggested that instead of collapsing, it would contract indefinitely under the force of its own gravity. The bright star would disappear, but it would still be there. Where there had been brilliance, there would be a blank. So with all of this in mind, I wrote my poems, minimizing words and maximizing horizontal and vertical white space while utilizing structural figuration. I believe the way a poem looks on the page is just as important as the words themselves. I'm going to read several poems now, presenting each one on the screen as we go so you can see the arrangement as well as hearing the words. Our first tenet, loss. My journey of loss started long before COVID, almost 6,000 days before, as my first poem illustrates. My mother has cancer. I pray for a cure. Then for her to die, mercifully. I never knew, could not have known before. I want to be a nurse. Years later, in March of 2020, 16 years after I became a nurse, and just days after the pandemic was first declared, I and my team suffered a new kind of loss while gaining a new uniform accessory. Mask. My borrowed face, incorporeal, blue. I give you only my eyes. And since COVID is still with us, I, like many of you I'm sure, find myself astonishingly and regretfully aware that I now have friends and colleagues whose faces I have not seen for almost 2 years, and some newer hires whose faces I have never seen. 5 days after the pandemic was declared, we received our first known positive patient in my ER. He arrived via EMS on a BiPAP without a viral filter. This is what followed. He arrives choke-winded, vespid breath like pollen on a windshield. I am the first one. I steady my gloved hand across his chest, his heart an angry fist. We place a breathing tube. I step back and hold my breath. His lungs bloom, hands open like sunflowers. This man died the next day, alone in our ICU, the first of many. We often inform their families and loved ones via phone or iPad. And what do we say? When they ask how he died, I tell them, he found the gate unlatched, crossed the downy path into the volant field, pressed his palm against a river birch carved with his name, his breath a brace of stars, and never looked back. 6 of my frontline and first responder colleagues have died of COVID over the course of 5 pandemic surges, one of them at the 275-day mark, a medic with the Houston Fire Department named Jerry Pacheco. I wrote this poem as an elegy for him. We painted your colors on the ceiling of the ambulance bay, lit flameless candles, read your name. When Christmas cases bloomed and the snow came, we doubled our ranks to process the living and the dead, lost power as the generators sang to shouts of vents, BiPAPs, oxygen tanks. This next poem is from my first book, Scissored Moon. Note the absence of white space and figuration. I wrote everything in couplets back then, lines in pairs, like a rib cage. A cleric once told me, suffering is holy, and anyone who cares for someone who is suffering is performing a sacred act. Relic. Quietly, they concede, leaving pennies at your feet, clove oil at your bedside, a constellation of symbols etched across the greaseboard like cave scrawl. In your palm, a withered blade of split stone, fluted reeds like hollow wings in flight. Eyes closed, lips unparted. I collect you like clover in the green fleck of my eye, like bone chips at the altar. And what follows loss? What is the pandemic's ever-present mercurial companion? Grief. Tom Lombardo, my editor at Press 53, calls this poem the nurse's rant. I composed it in one sitting early in the pandemic, long before the cruelty of the Delta variant. And I say that knowing full well that perhaps the worst is still yet to come. The Elysian Fields, 52 days out. No snow is there, nor heavy storm, nor ever rain. The Odyssey. When the last bed is taken, and patients are already booked, 2 in each room, where shall he go? When the last hallway spot is filled, and the aisle by the ambulance bay formerly used for broken IV poles, and the recliner that sits next to the supply cart but still in the eye line of the charge nurse, and the black chair in the blind corner, and the corridor along the admit desk that can hold 6 stretchers but only has outlets for 3 cardiac monitors and 2 oxygen concentrators, and the alcove saved for CPR calls because it has a curtain and wall-mounted oxygen and buys us time to pull someone else out of a room and into the hallway on a stretcher. And where will that stretcher go? And who shall care for him when the nurses are pressed and the doctors can't keep up, and 3 of our staff are among those admitted and waiting for beds in the lobby, and the travel nurses are overrun after only 2 days of clinical orientation? And how shall we shield his cough that sounds like the bark of my dog Homer, from when I was 7 and he was 15 and suddenly left to live on a farm where he could run with other dogs in rolling fields and drink milk just express from a Holstein cow whose udder never wavers, and sleep in a hayfield stall curled beside a Shetland pony, where ventilators are planted in groves like pomegranates, and oxygen tubing and stylets are sewn into the green hair of the earth, and waterfalls spill over with convalescent plasma, and streams swell with remdesivir, and bottles of corticosteroids are plucked like apples from the trees each morning, and bushels of N95 masks are packed in pallets in a red barn flanked with pearl-lined gates, and evening meals are blessed with songs from a golden lyre, as we dine with friends, family, and colleagues we've lost, at tables ripe with summer-sweet fruit that never sours, and wine that never turns. The manifest result of severely stretched resources in the course of an unrelenting pandemic is death. Despite the best efforts of committed caregivers, and regardless of geographic location, all over the world, we still lose patients in record numbers. This poem acknowledges the darkness that dwells in our hospitals when we hold the living as well as the dead, and how we talk ourselves into making it bearable. If it helps you, 560 days out. A refrigerated truck arrives in the bay. For centuries, in the northern states, the winter dead have waited for spring burial because it's too hard to break the frozen ground. They were saved in barns and caves called dead houses. In 2005 alone, roughly 1,000 burials were delayed in the state of New York. This next poem, called Lie, was written 575 days after the pandemic was declared. It illustrates a scene one could witness on any given day in any saturated hospital. I tell you, it's okay. You fall asleep on a bench seat. I replace your keening oxygen tank hourly in the lobby. Someone else calls your wife with an update. I have worn this mask for 6 days. These are not my hands. This is not my face. And now, with a weary heart, I ask each of you to consider, where is the lie? At the height of any COVID surge, frontline caregivers face the harrowing question of whether or not they are truly helping anyone, or maybe even hurting people. My worst fear is that I will bring COVID home and hurt the ones I love. Second is that I will accidentally kill a patient by making the wrong decision. Who gets the bed? Who gets the hallway? Who sits for hours on a portable oxygen source in the lobby? Third is that I will lose my humanity. The degree of moral injury we're facing is obscene. At the height of the Delta surge, I started having nightmares. In my dream, my mother is alive, still ripe with cancer. Her eyes are the color of rain. I take her to my hospital, where there is a line spilling into the street, and watch her die on the sidewalk. And what do we do, despite our fears, despite how hard it is, despite the loss and grief? We show up. We do the work. I wrote this poem after Hurricane Harvey for my second book, Sky the Ore. I see it now as a prelude to the storms we never saw coming. Vespers. We stand together on the bank, slip into the laden arms of the dark water. Marigold, milkweed, all that is left of the light. The cellar of the lake. And yet, mercifully, each storm clears eventually, even if only for a little while, before the next one hits. In these flickering moments, we find our feet, our resilience. As a wellness tool, and to plant the illusion of order, I've developed a few rituals. This poem recounts what I now say to myself as I lower my head and walk into the hospital before every shift. Be a light, a living prayer, always your child. Courage, composure, kindness. Let no one die in the hallway today, please. Slow down, slow down, slow down. And what of when we serve as family for our patients, when visitor restrictions are strictly enforced, even and perhaps especially in moments of extremis? The privilege and honor of being the vessel, the messenger. Caroline. I call to tell him she is here and not here, that her heart stopped, then started again, and we are seeking her in every lamp-black corridor. And when I hold the phone to her ear so he can read to her, her eyes ring. Another illustration, a moment that pulls a sinking caregiver out of the well of loss and grief and into the sun. Sharon. Blackfoot daisies are your favorite flower. His first gift, a mood ring that still blooms green. And last night, here, in room 203, I counted the steps of his galloping heart with my fingertip. He called me by your name. I wrote this poem during our third COVID surge. It was inspired by a noisy cardinal fighting its reflection in my window while I was trying to nap on my day off. It is my ode to all who persevere in the pandemic, for anyone who has endured great losses and has shared and continues to share his time and heart in the service of others. Such devotion, such strength is a lighthouse for us all. Incarnadine. The cardinal at my window sings year-round, does not migrate or shed his colors, builds an open cup from parched grass and the hair he plucks from the dog's bristled ear, cannot bear the sight of his own face reflected in the pane, as a red river, a cleric's crown, an artery. My final poem is from my second book, Sky the Ore. It is a call to all of us. Tell your stories. Caregivers are the guardians and gatekeepers of the truth. With so much misinformation out there, now more than ever, the world needs to hear your voice. Speak. No one saw or heard. Don't tell anyone. Tell everyone. I offer my sincerest gratitude to all of you for your time and attention. It was my absolute honor to share this work with you. Thank you.